Vamos a dar inicio el día de hoy con la presentación de Werner Schmid. Nos va a presentar su ponencia en inglés. Les voy a leer un breve semblanza de Werner, quien es especialista en conservación de pintura mural y acabados arquitectónicos. Él es un conservador independiente, pero que ha participado en muchos proyectos del ICROM. Ha sido tanto como consultor como desarrollando algunos de los proyectos en diferentes instituciones, pero que están muchas involucradas con el ICROM. Ha sido profesor en materias relacionadas a la conservación de acabados arquitectónicos y de pintura mural, y ha impartido cursos a nivel internacionales a diferentes niveles, a profesionales de diversas disciplinas. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Esperamos que vaya llegando un mayor número de personas. Y muchas gracias, Werner.
Hello, good morning to everybody. I hope you will understand my English, which is not very sophisticated because it's not my mother tongue, so maybe that will make it easier. Today I would like to present you a case study project which actually was my main focus of my professional life for more than 10 years. It's the project of conservation of very important early medieval wall paintings in a church called Santa María Antiqua, which is on the Roman Forum in Rome. It's a place which is situated actually, maybe some of you were in Rome, others not, on the Roman Forum, which was, let's say, the administrative and political center of the ancient town of Rome. So it was the main town square, so to say. And it's situated between two of the seven hills of Rome. The Capitol Hill, which was, let's say, the sacred hill where the main temples were standing in antiquities, and the Palatine Hill, which is actually the hill where the palaces of the emperors were situated. So it was a hill which was reserved for the residence of the emperors. So it's just situated on the northwest corner of the Palatine, just at the slope of the Palatine. The church is important for two reasons. First of all, it is a very good example of reutilization of a pre-existing pagan, so ancient Roman building, constructed at the end of the 1st century AD under the Emperor Domitian, who rebuilt actually this whole area. So this building, the function in antiquities is not quite certain, but if you, is there a way to show with the mouse? Yeah. Here's the church, and here you see the structure. This is a ramp, a covered way which is leading up to the Palatine where the palaces were. So it was certainly in antiquities a building. I don't see the mouse anymore. Okay. Which somehow was closely connected to this ramp, which became from that time on the main access to the palaces on the Palatine Hill. So we don't know, there are only hypotheses of what this building was in antiquities, but probably it was sort of a vestibule where visitors going to see the emperor were sort of checked by guards. There were guards or something like that. Nobody knows exactly what it was. As a fact, the plan of this building was perfectly suitable to be transformed into a church. And this happened in the mid of the 6th century historically, at that time, Rome was again annexed to the Byzantine Empire, because for some years the Goths had occupied Rome, and so just before 550 the Byzantine Empire has again reconquered, for so to say, Rome. So the dating of the transformation into a church is put around 550 AD. So as said, the floor plan was perfectly suitable for the needs, the liturgic needs in terms of structural requirements of a building. The building in antiquities, you see here on the floor plan on the right, where I've written central nave, which actually is referring to the building already transformed into a church. In the Roman building, this was an open peristyle. It was an area where you had an open garden, like in the Pompeian houses, with the so-called quadriporticus, a covered corridor all around this central open space. At the back there were three vaulted rooms, a bigger central one and two smaller ones to the side of this bigger one. So it was very easy to transform this building into a church by just covering the peristyle and obtaining a sort of central nave, and using the two sides of the quadriporticus as the side naves. The central barrel vaulted room became the presbytery, and as it is a requirement for Orthodox churches, for Byzantine churches, there was also already the two side naves, the two side rooms that became side chapels that were necessary to prepare the liturgy. So we have also an atrium space where already in antiquities this space was always open, it was never covered. And this became also part of the church. First significance is that it's a very good example of an ancient pagan building transformed into a church. The other, maybe even more important significance are certainly the wall paintings. Here you have a view of Santa María Antiqua as it is now. Because as you will see later, it's the result of excavation, so it's a partially reconstructed ruin. This is a view from the atrium onto the church, onto the covered part of the church. Here is a view of the inside. So as said, the second and probably even more important significance are the wall paintings. These wall paintings are spanning a period which goes from the time of foundation in the mid of the 6th century until the end of the 8th century. One has to know that there are almost no paintings existing from that time in any other place in the world. The reason for that is that in the mid-8th century there was a movement against holy images which brought to the almost complete destruction of the painted heritage within the Byzantine Empire. There are two reasons why these paintings of Santa María Antiqua are still existing. Also, as you can see already on that photo, they are preserved as fragments, certainly. The first reason is that this iconoclast movement never happened in Rome. And the second reason is that the church was abandoned already in the mid of the 9th century, so after only 300 years after its foundation. In 847 there's a documented earthquake which brought to the destruction, to the partial destruction of the church, because probably some portions of walls of masonry collapsed from the Palatine on the upper level onto the church, and it is documented by a historic document that then the church of Santa Maria Antiqua was abandoned and was refounded as Santa Maria Nova, the new Santa Maria, near the Arch of Titus, so still in the area of the Roman Forum. So Santa Maria Antiqua contains, we can say, the richest collection of the so-called pre-iconoclast paintings. Certainly there were many other churches in Rome which had paintings from that period. But as I said, the abandonment, the early abandonment of the church somehow, we can say, stopped the history. We can talk almost of a Pompeii of the early medieval times, because history stopped while in most other churches history went on. These churches were modified again and again, and these early layers were almost completely lost. There are still some fragments in other churches still existing from that period in the crypt areas of these churches and so on. But we can say that Santa Maria Antiqua is absolutely the key reference for art historians who want to evaluate the stylistic development of painting in that period. Here you have a detail of the so-called palimpsest wall, which is probably the most famous part of Santa Maria Antiqua, which is just right to the apse in the presbytery, where we have 7 superimposing layers. 6 of them are painted layers. So 6 layers of painting from different periods. You have in this area one of the earliest paintings, which is represented, can you see the mouth? Here. By this so-called Maria Regina. It is a Holy Virgin with a child on her lap, and she's dressed up like a Byzantine empress, because this was at the time the iconographic model to represent the Holy Virgin. Part of this layer is also this adoring angel here with a yellow nimbus. So this was an isolated icon which occupied, it was not part of a larger painting scheme, and it is dated to the mid of the 6th century. There's something interesting, I would need another image to explain you better, but as we are close to the apse, basically you have to think that the apse is on the left. The interesting thing is that this painting was cut by the opening of the apse, because one of the most important transformations from a structural point of view when it became a church was to open the apse that was not existing in the pagan building. In the pagan building there was a niche, and this niche was transformed into an apse by cutting it out from the thickness of the Roman wall. So this very early icon with the Holy Virgin, this so-called Maria Regina, is a painting. There are 2 layers of painting from Christian period, which are from a time before the apse was opened, because this panel is cut on the left by the opening of the apse. So again, there's a whole story about regarding actually the historic development of the building as a church, and it's not clear at all these very early times. Also the exact dating of the foundation of the church is under discussion, and because if we think that the opening of the apse is the moment when it becomes a church, certainly having these images that have clearly a Christian subject indicates that the building was already used for Christian worship. Another very interesting layer is this one. It's this angel. This is an angel with a light-colored dress. You can see the wings behind. And part of this layer, so this layer is directly on top of the Maria Regina. It's part of an Annunciation, of which you have only this very small fragment of the face of the Virgin. This Annunciation already, it's the first painting layer that occupies this new space created by the opening of the apse. So this wall became narrower, and for the first time, it's the first layer of painting that occupies this new feature of the apse wall. You can see very easily the clear stylistic differences between the Maria Regina and the so-called fair angel. So this angel is called the fair angel because it's he, she, it, I don't know, is so beautiful. And so it was called the fair angel, also the Companion angel, because it clearly still reflects a Hellenistic tradition of painting, where you have the tonal modeling of you have the shadows, the chiaroscuro, which is still existing. You have this three-quarter movement of the face. So it's in clear contrast to the Maria Regina, which has this much more bidimensional style of a colored drawing. She's represented frontal. She very much reminds the mosaics of Ravenna, which are actually also from the mid of the 6th century. So it was a big surprise when Santa María Antiqua was rediscovered, that in parallel to this typically, so to say, Byzantine style, there was still a tradition of Hellenistic painting. You can see here also another layer, which is the last layer. Sometimes I don't see the mouse anymore. Doesn't matter. Disappears. Here. This guy here, he's a saint, and part of it is also this dark bluish background with white writing. As you see, all the writings are in Greek, because at that time Greek was the official language, as you know, from the time of Constantine on. The capital was not Rome anymore, but it was transferred to Constantinople, nowadays Istanbul. And this is the last layer of, actually, in the apse wall, which was painted at the very beginning of the 8th century under one Pope, John VII, who was one of the popes that commissioned more paintings in the church. So this is part of a huge scheme of paintings that covered the apse wall completely, but also the side walls. The whole presbytery was painted under John VII at the very beginning of the 8th century. So let's just spend a few other words. We saw that Santa María Antiqua is the key reference for stylistic development in painting. But you might say, now knowing also that Rome at that time was a sort of periphery of the Byzantine Empire, you might say, okay, these are the only paintings existing, but they are kind of provincial, they are made in the periphery of the empire. So maybe they are not really representing what actually happened in that cultural area at that time. From that point of view, art historians are absolutely agreeing that is not true, but that this church was highly important. There's a hypothesis that it was a sort of palace chapel because of its location close to the Palatine Hill, so that it was a very important church connected with the palaces on the Palatine, which throughout the Byzantine period were still maintained for visits from the court in Constantinople, the emperor or some other high officials. When they came to Rome, they still used parts of the palaces on the Palatine. And so art historians absolutely agree that painters who were active at Santa Maria Antiqua were painters that probably were directly coming from Constantinople, so the highest quality of painting from that time. So, I told you that Santa Maria Antiqua, the history of the church, stopped suddenly in 847 after an earthquake when it was abandoned. And then gradually the whole Roman Forum throughout the medieval times, due to erosions, landslides, crumbling buildings, was filled up. And the level raised and everything was sort of buried underneath. Also Santa Maria Antiqua was completely buried by soil and debris. This is a very famous view of the Roman Forum at that time, and you can see there are still some monuments which are sticking out from the ground. There are these three columns of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which is very close to Santa Maria Antiqua. And here you see a Baroque church that had been built on a higher level on top of a pre-existing chapel, which was founded at the time of Santa Maria Antiqua, an oratory that was part of the complex of Santa Maria Antiqua, which was then already had been replaced in the 13th century by another later medieval church, and then rebuilt in the 17th century with this Baroque church. Here you have another view, again the three columns of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, and the Church of Santa Maria Liberatrice, also by quite famous architect Pietro Longhi, somewhat an unimportant building. Behind you see the Palatine, the hill, and you see houses that are built into the ruins of the Roman buildings. Then the history of Santa Maria Antiqua continues, for so to say, for a very short period of very few months, only in 1702, because in 1702, due to the activity of a person, not an archaeologist, but a person excavating in the Roman Forum, a person who had obtained, as it was rather normal at that time, a license to excavate, to search for building material. So this guy was digging there and searching for nice blocks of marble and of travertine, and then by chance he discovered Santa Maria Antiqua. The site was excavated, it is documented, the event is documented by this watercolor, which is not in color, I have only a black and white image of it, and also by a very nice poem. And so the apse wall of Santa Maria Antiqua was exposed for some months, but then it was decided to fill in again this hole and to restore, for so to say, the garden of the nuns' monastery, because behind Santa Maria Liberatrice, to Santa Maria Liberatrice, to the Baroque church, was annexed women's monastery, and this was their orchard, and so they just wanted it back, and so it was filled in again. Sorry. Okay. And then we are in January 1900, and in January 1900, under the direction of Giacomo Boni, very famous architect and archaeologist who had just become a few years before that director of excavation of Rome. He was one of the first archaeologists in Italy who was interested in medieval archaeology because, and due to that document that I just showed you from 1702, and due to other documents that exist which sort of testify the location of Santa Maria Antiqua, he started to excavate this area of the Roman Forum, and the first thing what was necessary was to demolish Santa Maria Liberatrice, which is certainly not something that would be done today, but at that time this was still the case. Santa Maria Antiqua actually was not under the church of Santa Maria Liberatrice as Giacomo Boni thought, but it was behind, as you saw also before in the garden, under Santa Maria Liberatrice directly. The oratory of the 40 martyrs was found, which is another space also with wall paintings of the same period, which was annexed to Santa Maria Antiqua as a parallel history with Santa Maria Antiqua. So in 1900, from 1900 to 1903, the excavations took place, and in parallel to the excavation, also the first restoration of the wall paintings. In 1903, that's how the church looks like. It's already fully excavated. The higher parts of the walls are reconstructed, the vaults are reconstructed in the presbytery and in the other side chapels, walls that had collapsed, and only a few fragments have remained. So architectural conservation and also conservation of the wall paintings has been done already. The nave is still, the central nave is not covered yet. It remained open for some years until they decided in 1910 to make a roof on top of this central area to protect the paintings better against the weather. So from point of view of the first restoration, which took place in parallel to the excavation, what was done? Mainly what was done is that the painted surfaces were washed. We have a small document which is more or less giving us an idea very roughly what was the content of this first intervention. We unfortunately have not anymore any of the documents by Giacomo Boni, but just a small report, not small, it's quite a big report, done by one of his assistants, but 30 years later, so she confused, unfortunately, many things and so on. But there's a small chapter also on the conservation of wall paintings. So the painted surfaces and the unpainted plasters, because what I forgot to tell you is that Santa Maria Antiqua also contains a lot of unpainted plasters, which are very important because they testify in part the at least two phases of decoration of the pagan building, so of the building before it became a church. One you can see here, the strange brick elements. This shows you the surface, because here again we are on the palimpsest wall. It's just a small parenthesis to tell you, give you that information, where you can see the surface of a so-called opus testacum, which is a very thick, more than 10 centimeter thick plaster layer. which was the bedding plaster for an opus sectile decoration. So a marble inlaid decoration. The marbles have been removed, but this opus testatium, this bedding plaster, had remained and was used in medieval times as a ground, as a first ground for the paintings. So this is just an example of these very important also unpainted plasters that are existing. So cleaning with water, just maybe some mechanical removal of soil and so on, of the painted and unpainted surfaces. Disinfection of all the surfaces with formaldehyde to prevent the growth of microorganisms. Then waxing of the surfaces with a very thin coat of, in that case, Boni has accepted a proposal to use a mineral wax, fortunately, not beeswax. So a mineral wax, which is a sort of natural paraffin, which is called otzokerite. Otzokerite is the mineral term for this wax that was applied as a very thin coat. This was rather used at that time, that whenever paintings were coming out from the soil, to avoid this, let's say, problems of salt efflorescence, to avoid damage caused by the contact with the air, for so to say, they applied wax on the painted surface. And then what you can see here, the fragments were stabilized, or stabilized, for so to say, with cement borders. You see these cement edges. This is pure Portland cement that was applied all around the edges, also in some lacuna. And in addition, some metal nails, T-shaped clamps were inserted in the walls where the plaster was separated from the wall and lifted off and detached. So these were the two ways of sort of assuring, warranting the stability of the painting at that time. What is interesting to note is that at that time no pictorial reintegration was done at all, which fortunately, because at that time, if they decided to do it properly, it would have meant that it would have been done by an artist, and so maybe not according to criteria that we have today, but a bit more generously. So no pictorial intervention at all. So the project started in the autumn of 2001. We had first a small fund from the World Monuments Fund New York. This organization has continued after that to provide funding to the project, and have more or less sustained about a third of the total cost of the project, while 2/3 were provided by the Italian government. So condition survey from 2001 to 2002, we concentrated more thorough studies and analysis on the apse wall, which presented not only the most complex situation from a point of view of the stratigraphy of many different layers of plasters and paintings that were superimposed, but also from a point of view of the decay. So we thought that the apse wall would give us more information about both the techniques of the paintings, but also decay mechanisms and conservation needs. One of the first concerns always when you go to make a condition survey is certainly to understand the painting technique, and there was not much published about the painting techniques of wall paintings from that time. And so it was necessary to make some studies, as always, according to my opinion. It is very important, the eye of the well-trained conservator is giving more information in this regard than any analysis. Or we can also say scientific analysis should be supporting the observations, the visual examination done by the conservator. And one should certainly not start with scientific analysis without having very carefully observed visually the surfaces of the paintings. So, I mean, we, after this first examination, and certainly these studies continued throughout the project, because as you know, many things are understood even better when once you start to clean the paintings and really start the treatment. So it's an ongoing process in a way, this study of painting techniques. But it was possible to establish some common features of all paintings at Santa Maria Antiqua that, as I told before, from many different periods, certainly done by many different workshops. But there are still some things in common. First of all, that all of these paintings are using very lime-rich and very thin plasters. So a high percentage of lime and very, very few filler, which necessarily means that you can make only just very thin layers. The other common feature that you can see maybe quite well on the left lower image is that you have a very thickly applied paint, not only for the highlights, but a bit all over. In some paintings, all the backgrounds have this very kind of evident brush strokes and thickly applied paint. And so this, from the analysis, also it was confirmed that this indicates the use of lime milk as an additional binder in the color layer. So this is also a common feature of these paintings at Santa Maria Antiqua, that all of them use lime as an additional binder for the color. What is very interesting also is that when you observe the surface, in many places, in almost all paintings except the two earliest painting phases, with the Maria Regina and the one which is before the Maria Regina that I didn't talk about because it's a sort of a new discovery. It's not that I don't want to talk about it because it's a new discovery, but that there's even an earlier layer to the Maria Regina, so that this painting, Maria Regina, which was dated to the time of foundation of the church, is not the earliest painting of Christian subject. So except these two earliest layers of painting, all paintings are having as a filler chopped straw. So you see the imprints on the surface of this chopped straw, because you have to imagine that this church was buried in wet soil for 1,000 years. Which means that all organic matter has completely disappeared. Which is also interesting from a point of view of painting techniques, because already you can say there's no organic, there's no second painting, there's no organic binder, because nothing would have left except if there was a phenomenon like secondary carbonation, like we saw yesterday in Monapac, that could have also happened, that second painting has transformed into fresco painting due to secondary carbonation. So was very surprising in a way, because the use of chopped straw is very uncommon in Rome. So the imperial Roman paintings have no any vegetable fibers as a filler. And so this seems to indicate and to confirm also the Oriental provenance of these painters, as I said before. Art historians are quite sure that these painters were called from the High Court in Constantinople to work in Rome, and so this is a sort of confirmation in a way, or it kind of supports this hypothesis, because it seems that these painters didn't bring only their art, but also their technology, which means to mix lime with straw, which is a very typical Oriental tradition. Why this straw? So this straw had certainly had, from a technological point of view, a very precise function, because if you mix straw in the lime, you have the plaster remaining wet for much longer time, because the straw retains for a long time the water. So you can paint on a fresh plaster for a much longer time than on a normal plaster. So, use of chopped straw, and then again we always have the curiosity, is it a fresco or a secco or things like that. This is a bit our concerns, at least in Europe, where maybe here you have less. You have lime plasters here, so I don't know much about Mexico, but certainly there's always this thing that we already saw that lime was used as an additional binder, so this might mean that it's a lime secco painting or something like that. That they painted on an already dry plaster using lime as an additional binder, maybe re-wetting the plaster before or something like that. But we found some very interesting, and this is a problem. I mean, secco fresco problem is something that, from my experience, can be clarified only by visual examination. Only if you find features in the painting that are indicating this one or the other, then you are sure. Through any laboratory analysis, you can never be sure, because if you have cross sections, a secco painting looks exactly the same like a fresco painting. There's no difference. So, okay, one of the interesting observations here, we are again on the apse wall in the higher part, where we have a huger fragment of painting, which is done a pontate, you say in Italian, with scaffolding layers starting from the top, these bands which are more or less corresponding to the scaffolding heights of plaster, which are painted one after the other. And so you have here the joint between the first and the second puntata, and you see where the overlapping second puntata, the plaster has fallen off. You see the already painted surface of the first puntata underneath. So it means that they didn't apply only the plaster, which would also be normal. I mean, even if you prepare a secco painting, you would still apply your plaster in scaffolding layers, because it's just a practical way to apply the plaster. But it means that not only the plaster was applied, but it was immediately painted. So there was an intention of the painter somehow to take advantage of the freshness of the plaster for the binding of the painting. Other observations on the left, again in the same area, we found in raking light the impression of a fabric, of a tessuto, where you, which, okay, if it was only on the plaster surface, it wouldn't mean anything, but this is an impression on the already painted plaster surface. So it means when for some reason the painter maybe with his elbow went against the painting, it was already painted but still fresh enough to receive this imprint of the texture. So this is 100% proof that it's a fresco technique. On the right, you see another very interesting thing that you can see very often in Roman wall paintings, also in Pompeii, which is the imprint of fingernails. You see this like a little bit like small moons, half moons on the surface. This is because the painter used to paint to have his hand more still. He pointed it against the wall like that, and with the brush he made the little things. Huh? So you find these, this is a detail of the Maria Regina painting, you find them very close to all these pearls, these very beautiful pearls made with lime, which were the last elements to be painted in the painting. So these fingerprints kind of indicate that the plaster was still completely soft when these last features of the paintings were painted. So it's again 100% proof for fresco technique. Another interesting thing for studying painting techniques, it's a bit tricky, but we did it together with a friend from Prague, who has a friend at Olympus, who helped us to set up this thing, because it was always a bit my dream to be able to work with a stereo microscope, a very simple stereo microscope on a scaffolding, because I mean we always use stereo microscopes on easel paintings in the conservation lab. It's one of the most used tools to investigate. The absolute advantage is compared to the video microscope is that you see three-dimensional, so you can see what is under and what is on top, and you can also act with a small bamboo stick or needle and maybe remove a little bit and even be more sure what is on top, what is below, and so on. It's a bit tricky to work with it on a scaffolding. With this friend of my friend, he constructed this stand that can be connected to scaffolding. So basically it's quite nice to work on vertical surfaces. It's impossible to work on bolted surfaces or something like that. It's not practical enough. And you can make some very nice photos also, apart from the observations. You can have magnification from 6.7 to 45 pair. And here you see an example of the pearls of the Maria Regina. You see another example of this very brilliant blue, light blue, again in the Maria Regina, where without any pigment analysis you can also already see the particles of this blue pigment. And with some historical knowledge you can already be not 100% sure, but almost that it is Egyptian blue. And this is the blue pigment that was used in Santa María Antiqua all over. The paintings of Santa María Antiqua are amongst the latest cases of the use of Egyptian blue. There's still one later from the 11th century in San Clemente in another church in Rome. And then, as you might know, the knowledge about this very, very used and common blue pigment that also existed in green varieties, used since 2500 before Christ in Egypt, artificially produced. It's a double silicate of copper and calcium copper silicate, I think, yeah. So, strangely enough, the knowledge of producing this pigment then suddenly disappears in the medieval time. And you know that they had a hard time to make blues until the discovery of the artificial pigments in the late 18th, 19th century. They had a hard time because they had to use this precious stuff like lapis lazuli, which costed an awful lot of money, or they had to use also very costly and very unstable azurite and stuff like that. So here we have a very nice view of Egyptian blue. This stereo microscopy is also very useful to examine the plaster. You don't need almost a cross section. It's always almost more interesting because you have a different view of the plaster. It's more the view conservators use, that you see the surface and not a section. And here another example of a pigment. This is a very, again, brilliant, let's say, blue, light blue background color, which in that case has no Egyptian blue at all. You see these black particles. It's carbon black in a line matrix. Certainly carbon of a very special type that was probably selected from a special carbon from a special wood, which gave this very, very bluish tone. So you have here a polished cross section that shows you the plaster of this painting. This is a painting from the mid-7th century. You see also in the plaster a little fiber. It's very difficult to have fibers in the cross section, so if you rely your plaster analysis only on cross sections and you don't make any visual observations, you will think there's no vegetable fiber in the plaster. So the combination of visual examination and laboratory analysis is very, very important. And you see these black carbon black particles in the line matrix. This is also an interesting case because maybe, let's say, one of the interesting or fascinating things of this project was really the collaboration or the contact throughout these more than 10 years between conservators and art historians and archaeologists who in parallel studied the monument and its paintings. And it was really a good example of what should always be the case, that any conservation should be the opportunity to review the history of a monument and to really try to make all kinds of studies in different directions. So our study of the painting techniques and the stratigraphies was very important for art historians to better understand certain parallels, certain correspondence of fragments one with the other. So this, for example, was a very interesting discovery in a way, also very surprising, because you have on the left you have the fair angel, on the right you have a Saint Anne, which is a small icon which is painted also in the presbytery. Presbytery is there where the big apsis, and right to the apsis you have the fair angel. The right wall has this small panel with Saint Anne, very beautiful, which, strangely enough, this was already known by previous studies, had been left out from a repainting of the whole wall at a later period. So it was always thought that this might be from a scheme that was painted like 50 years before that last one, which is now covering all residues there, and it's the prominent layer on this wall, which however respected somehow this icon going all around with the plaster. So when we observed the painting, we already thought it looks very much like the fair angel, the way the flesh tones are made with very thickly applied line paint. You can see it now well in this photos because you should have a raking light photo. And then another thing was striking, this green background. We thought this looks really like the same color, and there's something. So we made the analysis and we found something very interesting, surprisingly interesting, because we saw that this green color is not a green pigment, it's not a green earth or something, which would have not given any information, but it's a mixture of yellow ochre, carbon black, and some few particles of red ochre. And you see that both screens are exactly having the same composition. I mean, it looks like they have used the same color pot, you know, exactly the same color pot. So in this case, we had really a striking proof that these are paintings from the same workshop. Okay, so when we examined the condition of the paintings, what was very important for us was to compare the archival photographs with the present condition of the paintings to understand what was lost, what has remained, and so on, the dynamics of decay. So we had two series, mainly two series of photos, the ones from the time of excavation, very high quality photographs made with this plate negatives, you know, like 18 by 24 negative, where you can really draw out whatever detail you want, very high quality, almost making us jealous even today for what is regarding the quality. And then we had another series from the 1960s. So when we compared certain areas, we found that in some areas we had quite a big change, like here, this is the wall to the left of the apse, the bottom part, where the painting has almost become invisible. We saw that this is the most, let's say, the most scaring sequence of St. Demetrius. He's painted on one of the pillars in the central one. And you see a sequence 1900, 1912, already very worn. And then 2001, when we started the project, you see really the water, liquid water was flowing on the surface. It's very evident, completely disappeared, only the ground colors are remaining. So then we saw in the apse, also there, big changes. I mean, the apse painting already was very worn when it was found. It was not at all in good condition, but in better condition than now. And as one example, you see the painted basement there with the circular motifs in 1903. And now, in 2001, basically invisible. Here is the palimpsest wall. Here we saw that if you compare 1900 to 2001, you always think in 1900 it was in worse condition, because the thing that happened is that this is a photo on how this palimpsest wall was found. Then there was a German archaeologist who made also very interesting watercolored black and white photos of the church. I don't have an example of them. Very nice documents. He insisted that he wanted to uncover more of the lower layers of the painting. So finally, after long discussions, they gave him the permission to remove unimportant parts of the background, like here, for example. This is was considered an unimportant part of the background, and he discovered the head of this adoring angel. And there are a few things that he, let's say, not very much, but where he enlarged a bit the lower layers and sacrificed part of the upper layers. So, but if you compare 1962 to 2001, it's like these games that you make, you know, where you have to find 5 differences, you won't find even one. I mean, it's exactly the same now. So no, fortunately, in this very important area, no evident change. Then part of the preliminary investigation was also, because already it was absolutely evident that there was a huge problem of humidity in the apse, and so a humidity survey done by an engineer. Here you see the moist area that was identified by the and here, I mean, this waterfront that was identified just with conductivity, electric conductivity measurements. So it's not a line, but it's more or less like indication. You see that the palimpsest wall, which is the one here, is out of this, except the basement is out of this very humid area. And then core samples were taken, which seems to be the only really way to establish the water content in a wall, destructive method, where you have to drill in to the wall, certainly selecting the places where you do it. And we found that, I mean, in the lower part, I mean, up to 40% of almost of the weight of the sample was water. So basically, mud came out. So all this left side of the apse wall is very much suffering from moisture. We saw actually from, due to the comparison of these archival photos, that actually the parts of painting that had suffered were exclusively those exposed to some form of liquid water. So if we go behind the apse, we can see the backside of Santa María Antiqua. Here's the apse behind here. Here you see a rock, volcanic tuff, natural rock of the Palatine, which is basically against the wall. Something very curious, because Romans, I mean, I don't still understand, because Romans always isolated their buildings from the hills. Why this building is not isolated? It's very, we made also investigations up there with core samples, all full. There's no empty space in between. It's very curious, not clear. You see here in the plan the apse, and we are looking from here, basically. So this problem of a very rapid decay of appearance of salts and so on, soon after excavation, was felt immediately as one of the main concerns in Santa María Antiqua. And so Giacomo Boni, already in 1904, he decided to excavate a sort of channel here, a ventilated channel, to isolate into the rock, into the living rock of the Palatine, in order to isolate the building from the moisture coming from this rock. Unfortunately, this intervention by Boni has not solved the problem. The moisture continued to be there. We will see later that it brought also to the detachment of the paintings in this chapel here, because also this wall suffered a lot from moisture. So this whole area suffered very much from this moisture, capillary moisture in this area. So we made certainly more investigations, not conservators, but our colleagues, architects and engineers made investigations. It took a very, very long time, until after years they discovered that there's a sort of natural spring, we can call it, in the pavement of this, at the bottom of this ventilated channel, where water is coming out. You empty it, and after 10 minutes it's again full, so there's a lot of water coming. Nobody knows whether it's maybe the end, of some ancient sewerage system, or whether it's one of the natural springs of the Palatine, because one of the water supplies in the very beginning of Rome was the natural springs around the hills. So there are natural springs at all. It's very likely that it's somehow the dead end of some sewage system coming down from the Palatine. There's also an interesting hypothesis, because you can't see it on that plan. There's also a plan which shows the sewage system. So there's a sewage which is passing, just believe me, more or less here, then it goes there, and then it connects to the main sewage system, which discharges all the water from the Roman Forum to the Tiber. So it's a hypothesis, it's not clear, but maybe through the fact that they opened these apps in medieval times, they destroyed some drainage system of Roman times in that area. They interrupted sort of the original drainage system and caused a problem which was probably already active at the time when it was still a church. Because what we find is, I told you, the whole presbytery was painted for the last time at the very beginning of the 8th century, which is not completely true, because the apse was again painted 50 years later, so in the mid of the 8th century for only the apse. And if you examine the apse, you can see that under this layer from about 750, which is very worn already, you find only very, very small fragments of the pre-existing layer. It's very, very difficult to understand something on the stratigraphy, which means that when they renewed these layers in the apse, they were already very worn, and it seems to indicate an already very fast decay of the paintings at that time, which would confirm the idea that maybe due to the carving out of this apse, they destroyed some original Roman drainage system which kept this area dry. Salts, big problem in Santa María Antiqua. That's also one of the things we did to identify all the different morphologies of salts. And we found that most of the salt is sodium sulfate. Sodium sulfate is a very dangerous salt. It's used by the scientists, as you might know, to make the artificial aging of samples, because it destroys better than any other salt the samples. Because the thing is that it can exist in two forms. One is tannarite, and the other one, which contains 10 molecules of water more, so it expands a lot in volume, is mirabilite. So according to the relative humidity, it can exist in different hydration forms, and that's why it's very dangerous. So this salt has not a natural, so to say, origin, but it comes clearly from the use of cement. Cement that is already used for the paintings, but also used for in bigger quantities for the reconstruction of the walls and so on. So it's clearly a salt that has been leached out from the Portland cement and has been diffused all over the place, because the wall is brick masonry. It's like a sponge. Due to the high humidity, it was sort of diffused all over the place. We have also some gypsum, some calcium sulfate, which has a tendency to crystallize under the surface, making this lifting off the paint layer and causing micro losses of the paint layer. And what is very interesting is that we found in all samples that we took, all cross sections, a layer of gypsum on top of the paintings, which is englobing, it englobes this dust particles, no? So it has gray appearance, grayish-brown appearance. It's gypsum, which is rather strange on a plaster. Because the plaster normally has quite a high porosity. The deposit of gypsum on the surface is rather normal for marble, for material which has a low porosity, or granite or something like that, but not for plaster. So talking with a scientist, it came out, and it's quite a good hypothesis, and was also confirmed by an observation we made during cleaning, because our curiosity was always to know whether this gypsum is on top or under the wax. But unfortunately, these are the limits of scientific analysis. They were not even ever able to show us the wax in any of the samples. Not with UV, not with anything, I don't know why. But you know that investigating organic material is always very difficult. So the hypothesis is that this gypsum incrustation, which is gypsum particles coming from the atmosphere as pollutants, which deposit on the surface, have deposited because of the presence of the wax, which has not allowed to make them penetrate into the porosity of, has sealed the surface sort of. During cleaning, as I told you, because we removed this gypsum incrustation, this was in most of the cases the cleaning we did to remove this brownish gray layer on the surface. We saw in one place only where it was, because this wax layer is very thin, so in one place there was a bit more consistent layer of wax that you could really touch, and it was clearly under that grayish deposit. So we know that this incrustation has formed after the discovery of the paintings. So yeah. We analyzed the salts also, first through X-ray diffraction, and then also with ionic chromatography. We try to establish a profile to see where are the higher concentrations, how the salt is distributed within the thickness of the wall. We found that most of the salt is on the surface, close to the surface, which somehow made us feel optimistic about the possibility to make reduction of salt, of the salt content. We also tried, but we gave it up. It didn't work. So the salts are very dangerous, but fortunately we have a very stable microclimate in Santa María Antiqua, because, as you know, salts are only a problem if they change their state of aggregation. So if they dissolve and recrystallize, every time this happens, then you have a small damage, and the more often this happens, the more frequent this happens, the faster and the bigger the damage will be. So our big fortune is that in Santa María Antiqua we have, due probably to the exposure of the building towards north, so only very few sunlight penetrates, and to the thermal inertia of the walls, thick walls, we have basically a microclimate that follows only seasonal changes. We have daily, you have here the curves of temperature and relative humidity. The blue line is the outside condition, outside parameters, and the others are different points where inside the climate was measured. So we have maximum difference of temperature of 2 degrees in one day, when outside you have like 20 degrees of difference. And very rarely we have a relative humidity which is almost all over the year above 70% relative humidity, which is considered to be a bit the threshold for salt crystallization of many salt mixtures. The critical thing is if you have fluctuations that go across the 70%, not in all cases, but that's a bit a general rule. So we have most of the time relative humidity above 70%, which makes that the salts are or always crystallized or always dissolved, as they don't change. And so the damage is very few. We have some episodes, especially in winter time in Italy, you have this cold and very dry air. Then also inside you have sometimes a sudden drop, and there are some places where you can see where it drops suddenly below the 70% threshold. And these are moments where there's a risk for damage due to salts. But basically, and a confirmation, I remind you the comparison of the palimpsest wall, where there's no change between since 1962, and also the palimpsest wall is full of salts. It confirms that the interior conditions, microclimatic conditions of the of the church are very favorable for the conservation, long-term conservation of the paintings. So the columns are areas where you have capillary water, excessive water content in the masonry, or leaks from the roof and stuff like that. So the former restoration treatments, first restoration we said already during excavation. Then you have another conservator, very famous Italian conservator, one of the top conservators at that time in Italy, Tito Venturini Papari, who keeps on working for quite some years in the chapel that I showed you on the plan before, left to the presbytery, where also you have these moisture problems, and I told you that they detach the paintings after a while from there. He keeps very hard waxing, stabilizing, putting cement where things have collapsed. Again, he put some new borders, edges around the fragments and so on. So to keep under control these paintings was a concern which was Tito Venturini Papari was entrusted with that. Then he moved to the apse itself, and in the apse we have one of the first treatments where not only stabilization was done, cleaning, but also in painting. So there was an aesthetic concern by this conservator who he comes out from a document where he makes a proposal. He certainly expresses it in very strange words that might have to be interpreted. They're not so clear to us today. But it seems to indicate what we found afterwards during restoration, that he in-painted this full-tone retouching, very well done full-tone retouching. I wouldn't be able to match the color as well as he did with tempera. He tried to reduce the visual impact of these many dark grey cement fills in the apse painting with these retouchings. And then he proposes also to revive the paintings with tempera. And in this case, we found that the original color was certainly in many parts glazed over with a tempera color to make it become more bright, and so these interventions were done. Then in 1910 again, the first detachments were made of paintings from the two pillars of the central nave, where you saw this very unfortunate saint that completely disappeared from that area. They decided after long discussions, one has to say that at that time really they were working very seriously. They had an interdisciplinary commission at the ministry, and it's all documented. All the documents are still available, and there's a very, I don't know exactly now the wording, but a very nice statement which kind of says no to early proposals to detach paintings by saying that there's talking about the intimate relationship between the building and the paintings and the harmony and so on, which should not be destroyed and should be maintained. A very nicely expressed way of kind of pushing for, as far as possible, for in situ conservation already at that time, because you have to understand that detaching wall paintings was very common in Italy at that time. Still, Cesare Grandi in 1963 has a chapter on conservation of archaeological paintings where he says, take them off, more or less. I mean, if you want to save them, no? So, then, again, after the Second World War, the Istituto Centrale per il Restauro became responsible for the conservation of the wall paintings of Santa Maria Antiqua. And again, in that chapel to the left of the apse, they decided then to detach the two panels. Also one from outside in the atrium, in the open space was detached. And then also the Istituto made another intervention in the apse, where probably they applied some early vinylic emulsion, some white glue, diluted white glue. At least what we found was something like that. The analysis didn't give a clear result, but something very, very sticky was on that surface. And it's a bit the time when these first emulsions come into use, the white glue and so on. And they made again an aesthetic intervention where they decided to paint all the cement fills with a beige color to make them better match with the painting. Then we have almost nothing, no interventions, and then in 1980s we have a few interventions inside the church, the left nave, according to modern criteria, with still valid results. We didn't re-intervene on that, on these paintings. And Ikrom also did some work in the atrium. So, architecture surfaces at Santa María Antiqua. Altogether we have 332 square meters of wall paintings, 244 square meters of unpainted plasters, very important, as I told you before, because many of them are related to decorative surfaces from the pagan period of the building. We have 100 square meters of mosaic floor, and about 57 square meters of other flooring from antiquity. Wall paintings that have been retreated after the first restoration during excavations are 134 square meters, so you see about less than half, much less than half. And 30 square meters of paintings were detached. So after this condition survey, these are summary results of the condition survey that was carried out in 2001-2. Part of the apse wall suffers from active decay due to the excessive wall moisture, and this corresponds to about 12% of the total painted surfaces in the church. Then this was a very alarming finding that about 60% of the painted surfaces and the unpainted plasters showed severe lacks of adhesion and internal cohesion of the plaster. So there was a real need to make a very, very urgent stabilization of these plasters. We found that the paint layer are generally stable, probably due to a good technique, a sort of fresco, as we saw in the beginning of my presentation. Fresco line technique, it's hard to explain. For me, it's still a fresco. I mean, because for me, a fresco is when the intention of the painters is to exploit, at least in part, the freshness of the plaster for the binding process. It doesn't matter that it's all finished on the fresh plaster, but if there's an intention to start on fresh plaster, then for me it's a type of fresco technique. So probably also due to that good technique, which made one body between this really thickly applied lime paint and the plaster, it becomes like one body. There's not the tendency really to detach one from the other. Only about 6% showed problems of adhesion. So during this first restoration, we calculated about 1.5 kilometers of cement borders and 2,000 cement fills were applied to the paintings. About 40% here you have it of the paintings were retreated in situ after the first intervention, and about 9% were detached and transferred to new supports. So after this preliminary survey, we also surveyed all the other areas of the church, but in a more preliminary way and a more general way, with using form sheets and so on, in order to be able to quantify, the conservation needs mainly, and to make be able to formulate a work plan and a tentative budget for the costs of what it costs to do the restoration of this church. We identified some very high priorities, and the first almost 3 years of the project after the preliminary investigation was dedicated fully to emergency stabilization of painted and unpainted plaster in the church and the atrium. Here you have just an example of one of the mappings of detached areas where you can have a feel on how much was really detached. The red areas are really areas that you can almost touch. I mean, when you touch them, they move, and there's a really risk to collapse. So you have to understand that never injections were made. The only way to keep these plasters in place was through these cement edges, and often the fragments were just held by the cement edges. Was the only stable part, and if they were not there, it's also something one should consider, because it's always very easy to blame our predecessors. Oh, what did they do? They put all cement, but it's not so easy, no? One has to be a bit subjective. It's hard to say. I mean, the cement has made the damage. It has released a lot of salts, as we saw. Other damages, not so much, because in the open area you have also the problem of the thermal expansion, which is different to the plasters, where you have all kind of other problems. But in a way, I would say, if they didn't put the cement, we would have lost more, probably. So, emergency stabilization, if you're interested to know what we used, you can ask me later. I will give you. And then, as also part of this second project phase, we made some conservation restoration trials, where we also made the cleaning, treatment of the cement, and so on, where we tried to establish a concept for the final treatment of the paintings. And we thought it would be useful to have these samples. We had 3 of them, this is one, for a longer period exposed, to give really time to reflect and to discuss within the multidisciplinary team what we want as a final result. And then the treatment started. It started first in one of the side chapels, where we had the opportunity, again with funding from the World Monuments Fund, to restore all the surfaces of one of the 2 side chapels. We, from the beginning, thought that our concept would also include that we do not concentrate only on the wall paintings, but we will concentrate on all architectural surfaces in a given space. So we would like to revise all the surfaces and stabilize and so on. So one of the big issues was the removal, or not removal, of the cement, the treatment of all these cement edges and cement fills, which were considered to be aesthetically detracting. Because from a point of view of conservation, you can't say that it was necessary to remove them, because the damage that the cement had done was done. The release of salts. It's an irreversible process that had happened already. And other big issues concerning damaging effects of the cement could not be found. But still, the cement edges, these dark snakes all around and these dark spots, were considered to be sort of extraneous elements to the paintings and disturbing factors from an aesthetic point of view. So it was decided to remove them. Our policy was considering that, what I just said, that the cement was not anymore a source of damage. We didn't have to be very severe in removing it radically. So wherever it was possible, we left the cement, or part of the cement. We just remodeled the edges and covered them with lime plaster. So sort of coated them with lime plaster. So our objective was not to completely eliminate cement, but just to eliminate it visually. We just didn't want to see it anymore. So whenever the cement was on the surface, because all fills were done with flush, So even with the pictorial surface, whatever cement was on the surface, also the upper part of the edges, where it connects to the plaster, were removed. We thought that this node cement should be at the level of the paint layer, and the cement was then replaced with lime plaster fills, which were kept slightly, very slightly under the level of the original paint layer, imitating the worn surface of the original plaster. So we decided, in most cases, except for the very large lacuna, to try to imitate the worn surface of the original plaster. Here you see the cutting with dental drill and diamond-coated grinding heads, and the slicing, cutting like a chocolate tablet, and remove it. And a long, long work, but yeah, hard, also very dusty. And the effect of the removal of cement you can appreciate from this comparison. This is before and after in the chapel right to the apse, the so-called Chapel of Medical Saints, which was this one that we had as a pilot project. So the first one that we had the opportunity to restore, to treat all surfaces of this chapel. And you can see it also from this example, the effect of removal of cement, and certainly some pictorial reintegration that I will explain you later, if there's still time, on how we did that. And here it's very evident where you had this very high quantity of cement fills, dark ones, that were all replaced with this plaster imitating a natural situation where the original plaster is worn, so standing a bit behind the original surface. Then cleaning. Cleaning was a big issue. I mean, I told you already that in most places we had the cleaning was consisting in removing this grayish-brown gypsum incrustation. So we used basically two types of cleaning agents. One is the ammonium hydrogen carbonate, and the other one is the anionic ion exchange resin, the OH type of the ion exchange resin, which dissolves gypsum. We had bigger problems in places where other restorations had happened after the first one. So we found also some other materials that were applied, and we had to combine often the cleaning with organic solvent mixtures, and the other one that I already mentioned. The strange thing, but I think it always happens in conservation, that in the same monument, whenever we started a new wall, we had to start almost again the same process of testing, because nothing worked anymore. I mean, it was not homogeneous at all from one place to the other. Also, in this case, the stereo microscope gave very interesting possibilities of making cleaning, very small micro cleaning tests under the microscope to really see what happens now with the cotton swab, what happens, and it gives you also a good feel of being sure of what you're doing, by controlling really what is coming off and what is not coming off. So it was very useful for that purpose as well. Here you see some cleaning trials. I don't want to now give you all the details on the cleaning methods, but basically all of these slides that I show you now are cleaning done with slightly different methodologies, because different areas. And you see that sometimes really we, like on this wall, which I mean, always conservators say, before we couldn't see anything and now something. But in this case it was really true. It looked like an unpainted plaster, this wall, due to the heavy surface deposits, and you see here different what comes out. So a lot of recovering, regaining better legibility, readability, visibility of the paintings due to the removal of this surface deposits. Here we are in the chapel of Theodotus, which is the one on the left of the presbytery, where this one conservator has intervened again and again with wax. You see here, it was impossible to make a photo without having the cloth. Very, very thick wax coat. So not only the first, but here we made also analysis and we found beeswax. He used beeswax afterwards, not this mineral wax that was used with Giacomo Boni. And in this case, the cleaning consisted of reducing the wax coating, which had absorbed dust. And, so it was a solvent cleaning with the brush, like an easel painting, very long-lasting process. If you went too far, you saw that the wax had become binder of the paint, so you had to stop at a certain moment. And this was our policy all over Santa Maria Antiqua. We didn't remove the wax. We considered the wax as sort of almost, how to say, security level for the cleaning, so that our objective was not to remove the wax because we didn't see any real damaging effect of the presence of this wax. Again, here was an intervention also of the Istituto. We found this PVA on the surface, so we had to use a combination of solvents and ammonium bicarbonate to get to cleaning in the apse itself. Very difficult, because of this very heavy salt incrustations that had to be removed mechanically first. And in the upper right photo you see this presence of a yellow glaze that comes off in the halo, which is this tempera glazes that were applied in 1910 by Venturini Paperi. So we had to also deal with how far to remove the former restoration or not, or leave them. And so here, aesthetic presentation. You see here a sequence that shows you a bit what we did, because our aesthetic presentation, we decided to be really make a minimum, just to reduce the disturbance created by losses or by replaced fills, replaced cement fills that we replaced with a lime mortar that was also certainly lighter in color. And we used this method, which is called, in conservative jargon, it's called the aqua sporca method. You might know this word, which is using a color glaze which doesn't have any clear. It's a non-color. Let's say it's corresponding to the dirt, to the patina color, and. So what we did is basically we distinguished between micro losses in the paint layer that were closed or with the same aqua sporca but darker, which was in most cases enough. You didn't have to use color. Or sometimes we colored a bit the aqua sporca. We made it a bit yellowish, a bit reddish. So with the idea to create slightly more consistent micro fragments, to get rid of this very strong vibration of created by very, very small losses. So our criterion was to close visually the micro losses up to 1.5, maximum 2 millimeter, surrounded by original color. This was the criterion for it. And all the other areas were just toned back by using this grayish-brown color. So I show you just some details now before and after the treatment in different areas of the church. Here you see also that on the left side you see some more modern fills because in this wall, only in this wall, there were some interventions for non-documented intervention trials of the 1970s, where they had already tried to remove the cement and to replace it with cement with lime plaster fills. So on the left you see them, but we again removed them and used the same criterion of imitating existing situations in the painting itself, or we imitated the worn surface of the painted plaster, or we imitated the surface of the underlying plaster, which is the ground plaster. In this case, the painting is done with 2 levels of plaster. And it shows very clearly that a big part of our aesthetic presentation was the fills, actually. I mean, the painting part is almost nothing. It's almost more, the presentation relies almost more on the quality and the way we decided to make the fills. Here again, comparison. This is one of the detached panels in this chapel, where there's on the left, you see these stains, we still don't know exactly, but also PVA, some stuff, where they had consolidated some paint layer flakes and they just become dark brown, very disturbing. What is also interesting that we said already in the beginning when we made the first trials and discussed the concept, that we would not insist at all with the cleaning of surfaces other than the painted ones. Because we said that it's very useful to maintain this grayish-brown patina, which makes them look almost like a background, like a monochrome background. Unifies all the different materials in a way. The brick wall and the unpainted plasters all have the same hue, brownish gray. And as we thought that our main concern is to enhance the paintings, we would not insist with the cleaning, so only very light cleaning was done on all other surfaces which were not paintings, in order to maintain this overall patina color, which was very suitable to make a sort of background from which the painted fragments are. This is another detached panels full of cement fills. Horrible. Still very fragmentary after treatment. Nothing really changed, but what changes is that you're not anymore detracted by so many disturbing elements. No? You can concentrate on what is left of the original. That's the important thing. We also decided to remove some of the metal cramps. In the beginning we thought to leave them. We also thought it's not possible to remove them. Then we found not very intelligent, but we found this solution. As they are made from copper, it was possible to just cut off the wing and to leave the shaft inside, which was impossible to extract. So we just removed the wing and we reduced a bit the shaft and made a little fill. And so in areas where there were very high concentrations of this copper clamps, we removed them. Just another detail before and after, like that. And it's very strange because, it's not strange, but many people said, oh, but this painting is much more complete now. Did you reconstruct it? No, we didn't. But the effect is just that the eye of who looks to a painting doesn't see what is there, but what is elaborated in the mind. So it's the perception of the images is very complicating. So when you're not disturbed anymore by so many factors, extraneous objects in the painting, you are able to concentrate on what is left of the original color and to mentally reconstruct what is missing. And this is really what is happening after an intervention like that. You are encouraged to mentally reconstruct what is missing, and so it gives you a bit the thing that you see more. Again, a high concentration of metal clamps here and cement edges, which partly left, I don't know now, for example this one, which was very thick here. So again we made a groove, kind of with a dental, to separate the original painted plaster from the cement along the where they connect, and then we just modeled with chisels when the cement was too much spread horizontally. We made it a bit more vertical, and then we covered it with the lime plaster after having applied some acrylic emulsion to isolate it and to make a better adhesion. So this is the palimpsest wall. Actually, in the beginning we said this is perfectly visible. We don't have to clean here. This is okay. No, we were also a little bit afraid to, but it's such an important part of the. So, and but then we made some cleaning tests, and it was not possible to not to clean the painting. What was also very interesting is that by removing, I don't know whether it's, maybe by removing the cement, and in this case we really completely removed the cement edges, it was rather easy because most of the cement was connecting to the upper layer, which had a very weak plaster. So it was very easy to detach the cement from. But so we recovered in many areas like up to 1 centimeter thickness of the painting, of the underlying painting. So it was also interesting use. We also made some discoveries. We found the gold, traces of gold leaf under the cement in the halo of the Maria Regina. So we were able to discover that these halos were gilded before. This is inside the apse, a very deteriorated area, very repainted also in part by farmers. Not repainted, but yeah. And this is just to give you an idea of a bigger, larger surface, what in the apse. The presbytery, what was the effect. We also treated the seal, for example, the cement reconstruction, which was very stainy, indicating that there were lots of water infiltrations due to the lack of maintenance in certain periods. And this was probably one of the moments when the salts were dissolved from the cement and distributed evenly all over in this brick wall. All surfaces were treated completely. And you can see here also, this was actually one of the last things we made, is that we cleaned the floor, the mosaic floor. Very beautiful mosaic floor. It's a very, very interesting restoration by Giacomo Boni, who integrated the missing parts in this way that he just left monochrome squares and used a brick instead of marble, and which was also basically invisible before, due to soil, just. And here, how long? Only 4 minutes. How long? 4 minutes? Okay, this is just briefly another part of the operations where we what we called recontextualized the detached paintings. We made new supports for the paintings, and our objective also here, there was not so much, it was not so much conservation driven, because they were more or less okay. These are the early detachments made in 1910 that were when the paintings were transferred to cement panels. it's a iron structure with cement, iron necked and cement. But they were in good condition, objectively. They didn't have really real problems, but they were good. And so recontextualization meant to us that our objective was to reach a result where people who don't know that these paintings were detached would think that they were never detached, basically. You know? So things are big work, taking down this stuff, very heavy, and removing the cement you see here from behind, grinding, and then making new supports, trying to not go above the thickness, maximum thickness of the original plaster. In this case, my colleague Antonio Iacarino, with some of the photos, he dealt with that. His interest very good in inventing case-by-case solutions. So he basically made a sort of mold of the backside of the paintings in order to reduce the thickness of the plaster, of the support. They are made in carbon fiber, so also this gives you the possibility to make very thin supports that are very rigid. Here the removal of the facing, and then one thing what was important, that we cut the support around the edges of the fragment, while before they were looking like paintings that are fixed to the wall because of these geometrical shapes. In this case, you would see again the wall where there is no painting. This is Antonio here, putting back the support to the wall, and then restoration also here. One thing was also important, that we decided to make exactly the same aesthetic presentation, the same type of fills like on the paintings remaining in situ. And this is another, this is the chapel here. You have a total view now. And sorry that I gave you almost only details of paintings. I didn't show you much of the general views. This is the chapel of Theodotus on the left of the presbytery, where you had these moisture problems on the south wall due to the moisture that I explained before. And when we started the project, this painting was missing because it had been detached in 1948. This one, the crucifixion, was detached in 1954, but had gone back to the original site. While this one had been removed because it had been transferred to canvas. It was hanging in a space of museum space, if you want. And it was on a canvas stretcher, so it was unsuitable to be put back to the original site, which is very humid. And so we transported it back to the site, and first the cleaning here of the surface. There were probably lots of residues of the animal glue that was used to face the painting when it was detached. And then the facing again facing, transportation, removal of the canvas from the backside and of the stretcher frame. And then Antonio is in that case, as we had only a very, very thin layer, because almost it was only paint layer and like ½ millimeter of original plaster, because they had thinned it completely. It had become really a canvas painting. So we took advantage of this flexibility of the painting to make a surface which is modeled, sort of. This was one of the ideas, because none of the medieval plasters are even. They're all very kind of wavy. So certainly this is pure invention, but we wanted to give, because one of the things that identifies a painting as a detached painting is the complete flatness normally. So we wanted to do something wavy. The other problem was that the painting had to connect perfectly to the side walls that had remained and to the lower part of this kind of painted curtain. So it had to be like inlay, what you do with your teeth, not perfectly. And so partly the support was modeled for that purpose on site directly. And then the transfer to the support materials, you can ask me later. you're interested. And the gluing under vacuum, and then putting back. Again here the edges are cut out, you know, around, so again it gives you this effect which doesn't make you think that it's a detached painting. So one of the important effects is that you see at the wall where there's no plaster. And then removal of facing, and here you see something interesting. Just we were very happy because the positioning was a bit difficult because we had to use the old photographs and so on. But then we saw after positioning that you see here the residue of a cement edge, which is perfectly in this area, which was around the painting. And then again making fills, removing the old ones, putting new ones. And then these are the cuts, because this painting was detached in 3 parts. So this is an artificial lacuna, and we decided to close it with tratteggio. So our only exception, in a way, the only areas where we used tratteggio was where we identified something as an artificial lacuna. Okay, that's it.
Muchas gracias, Werner. Nos va a ayudar acá a leer un poquito. Yo primero quisiera agradecerte, Werner, me parece una exposición, estuvo larga, pero la verdad es que estuvo muy, muy interesante desde los primeros ejemplos, ¿no? de ver la estética de las pinturas, la forma en la que nos explicaste el contexto de cómo desde los primeros, la construcción, después el reuso del edificio, me pareció muy interesante. Después también toda esta parte de la documentación de los procesos de intervención desde 1700 que se empieza a excavar, se vuelve a rellenar. Esa documentación también me parece que es muy interesante, y después, bueno, toda la descripción de un proyecto muy, muy complejo, integral, ¿no? En el que yo creo que hay muchísimas cosas que serían muy interesantes que abordemos, que te preguntemos, ¿no? Me gustó mucho la combinación del uso de la microestratigrafía con los cortes y cómo eso enriquece la comprensión, ¿no? De la técnica de manufactura, y cómo eso les permitió después también hacer las intervenciones, ¿no? En la parte teórica también creo que es súper interesante discutir cómo decidieron hasta dónde llegar, ¿no? El tema de la mínima intervención, que es un tema que ahorita traemos mucho discutiendo acá en México. Me parece que el ejemplo de lo que ustedes hicieron es muy acertado, ¿no? Hasta dónde llegar y cómo el tema de la percepción de las lagunas, o sea, con solo bajar ese tema, ¿no? Las lagunas te permite tener una percepción completa, y cómo eso nos hace que podamos leer de manera integral un objeto, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, yo ya no sigo abundando más, cedo la palabra para quien quiera hacerle alguna pregunta a Werner. Anímense. Sí, ahí ve. ¿Quieres el micrófono?
Sí, ¿se escucha, no?
Ahí te lleva.
Ahí va.
No me explico el deterioro que mencionaste, que existía una capa de yeso sobre la superficie entre la cera y la capa pictórica. No me entra cómo demonios llegó ahí y cómo se depositó de esa forma tan homogénea. ¿Hay capito? No, yo no capito.
There are different theories of how gypsum incrustations form. You know, there's a lot of studies on marble and especially stone and so on. And I'm belonging to one of those who believe very much of the fact that gypsum is not formed directly by sulfuric acid meeting the calcium carbonate of the object and transforming it into gypsum, but gypsum comes as particle from the atmosphere, because one of the most striking proofs is that you find gypsum incrustation on bronze. Okay. On the bronze, where there's no source of calcium carbonate, you find gypsum incrustation. So one theory, especially by Mauro Mattini, I think he is the one who, with a lot of controversies during, because the others don't believe, but doesn't matter. He says that basically the most common, I think all over the world, the most common dust particle is calcium carbonate in the air. So when the sulfuric acid meets in polluted atmospheres, these calcium carbonate particles transform it in the air already into gypsum. So it comes already formed as gypsum on the surface as a deposit. In our case, normally you say plaster is a very open porosity, so you will find this gypsum under the surface mainly. In our case, due to the fact that the surface was sealed with wax, the porosity was, it behaved like a non or very low porous material and deposited on the surface.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, you said the gypsum was also on the what?
Bronze.
Bronze, yeah, thank you.
Werner, who was a client of this project, it was a superintendent.
Yes.
And you delivered the project in 2013. Is it still going on?
It's like many projects, it's almost finished.
No, because that was my question. So after you completed this, this very elaborated project, what comes next?
What comes next is not anymore under my control, unfortunately, but it would be to open it to the public. We pushed very much from the beginning, because as we had this kind of, how to say, commitment with the World Monuments Fund that gave a lot of money to the project, and they, in USA, Mexico, it's rather normal to say, okay, we don't restore a monument for its own sake, but we restore it to, if possible, if compatible with conservation requirements, to present it to the public or to make it. That's not so common in Italy, unfortunately. And so from the beginning we had meetings. So very interesting, where we established very interesting things. Because you have to imagine that Santa María Antiqua is the main early medieval monument on the Roman Forum. There are others also. But it could be like used as a center for early medieval itineraries on the Roman Forum. It could be used to explain how the Roman Forum in the Palatine developed in the so-called dark medieval ages, after the Roman Empire was kind of transferred to Constantinople and the decadence started and so on. So what happened there, could be explained to the public through Santa María Antiqua, apart from the exceptional experience to visit the monument. It's a wonderful monument, really very. We had actually during restoration for 2 times we opened the monument for visitors during ongoing worksite, and you can't imagine, they had to book, fully booked out. There's such a demand from people, even from Rome, most of them are Roman citizens, because the monument, you have to understand, it's closed for no real reason since 1981. The reason is mainly management, that there are not enough guards to keep it open and so on. So our idea would be, I mean, we defined already some of the things like that we would allow only guided visits, small groups, not open, not free visits. That doesn't make sense. That's all. But this is not in my hand. We hope still, but sooner or later it will be possible.
Hablo fuerte. Debido al problema del cemento, tanto en la consolidación del edificio como de la pintura, se decidió remover el cemento de la pintura mural. ¿Qué pasa con el cemento que se usó en los morteros para consolidar el edificio? Se propuso eliminar algo de lo que estaba cercano a las pinturas y reemplazarlos por morteros de cal, o esa parte de la intervención ya no se propuso o se realizó. ¿En qué queda esa parte?
No, there was no way. I mean, the structurally used cement remained. Because also there, I mean, you know, it's like the damage that the cement did is now already done. I mean, it's a kind of concluded episode. Now the cement, one doesn't have to exaggerate with the cement. It's not so bad. It's okay. But it's a bit superficial, you know. Sometimes they're teaching, oh no, it's cement. It's like poison. Look at it. See what it has done. Take out the historical photos. Evaluate. No, it's not so super bad.
Okay,
You wouldn't use it anymore now.
You mentioned that part of the presentation of your work had to do with the feelings that you did. Did that have to do with a special color, or texture, or what kind of presentation did you give it?
I mean, what we are always doing, I mean, when we make this archaeological presentation, huh? It's something that we learned, at least in 2000, something is that we don't invent anything. No? We just look around in the original and take reference. The original suggests us what we have to do in terms of texture, of the fills, in terms of depth of the fill, or where it is from the surface compared to the surface, how much it is under the surface, because we always try to keep it slightly under the surface in a way. Because we always imitate, we always look around in the original and say, okay, this is a nice point that we could imitate. Here the blast is worn and this rough structure comes out and is slightly behind. That's maybe a good thing. And that we did in Santa María Antiqua. And also from a color point of view, it's not that we decide should we put a reddish gray or bluish gray or yellow. No, we look around, we imitate some of the, because you always find some perfectly already finished parts in the painting that you can take as a reference, and you imitate those. No? And then it becomes very natural, because then what you add and what is already there is perfectly, you can't tell anymore what is what. More or less. I mean, it becomes like one level, which is. Does that reply to you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think it's the best way to do it.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, le agradecemos a Werner por la exposición que tuvo con nosotros.